Social disadvantage overseas can be really confronting, but it's also confronting in Australia, and it's confronting for this reason. I want to pose a question to you. How is it that we live in one of the wealthiest nations on earth that has ever existed in human history, and yet we still have high levels of social disadvantage? How is that possible? And as we peer into the future, are there grounds for complacency? Do we actually think that in the future social disadvantage will get better in Australia or worse in Australia? So they're the questions that we're going to pose. Niels Bohr won the Nobel Prize for Physics in 1922, so he was a pretty bright guy. But he also made this statement: prediction is very difficult, especially if it's about the future. And the reason it's difficult is that as you go out, there are more and more variables that you've got to get your mind around. One way of thinking about the future is this cone of plausibility, which the academics love to use, but it's actually quite useful. What it's basically saying is the further you go out, the greater the variability, the more difficult it is to project the future, the greater the uncertainty. But here's the amazing thing. We as human beings, and we tend to think in terms of that blue line, we tend to think that the future is actually today with a few incremental changes. So it's very different from reality. Now just imagine for a moment you're an accountant living in London in 1912, you're 30 years of age, and you're thinking about the balance of your working career, the next 35 years. Do you really think you would have thought that in the next 35 years you would witness two terrible world wars, which would have killed tens of millions of people? You'd have seen communism coming to first Russia and then Eastern Europe. You would have seen a terrible financial depression in the 1930s. You would see the attempted genocide of the Jewish race in the first part of the 1940s in Europe. And you would see the Americans drop 2 atomic bombs on civilian populations in Japan. You see, the point that I'm trying to make is the future can be much stranger than any of us imagine it to be. Now, if you haven't heard of Moore's Law, then frankly it's time that you really did start to understand it, because it's dramatically reshaping our world. Moore's Law simply says that every 2 years, roughly, computer processing power will double. And that's been a pretty accurate predictor of computer processing power since the early 1960s. So just think about that. However powerful you think computer processing power is today, 2 years' time, it'll be twice as powerful. That's why this iPhone 7 in my pocket is so much more powerful, so much better connected to the world than the iPhone 1 I got 10 years ago. It's why, if you open your eyes, we're starting to see such dramatic improvements in artificial intelligence and innovation. It's why we're starting to see improvements in nanotechnology and robotics and 3D printing. See, the reality is that our world is changing much faster than most of us think possible. So my next question is, how are we preparing for the future? In my role as chair of Greenhill Australia, I visit the Philippines about every 3 months, and I go into the slums in Manila, which can be quite confronting. And on my last trip, I visited a school for very poor children. And on the wall of the school were these words: "For tomorrow belongs to those people who prepare for it today." So another question for you all: how are we in Australia preparing ourselves for this accelerated future? Now, when you think about the obvious areas of leadership in our economy, they tend to come from these sectors. And the first one is government. And government should be the leader preparing us for the future and should be showing leadership in solving social disadvantage. But the reality is we're frankly all switching off from government. The Australian National University put out a survey after every federal election, and they've been doing it since the late 1960s. So we can actually follow trends. And the latest survey, which was done after the federal election last year, said amongst other things, 2 things. That 74% of those people surveyed thought the people in government were looking after themselves. And only 26% of those surveyed thought that people in government actually were looking after our interests. Now, the point that I want to make here is you cannot have effective leadership from government if you don't trust government. So on now to the business sector. The business sector plays an amazing role in Australia, because frankly, without business, we wouldn't have jobs. And without jobs, a lot of us would be in poverty. But at the end of the day, business is there to maximise profits. It's not there to solve social problems. And whilst there's a movement to try and encourage it to do that, in a way we want them to focus on maximising profits because we want them to create employment. Now in reality, if you look at our big organisations, our big corporates, they are net reducers of employment at the moment, and I'll come on to why in a minute. The third sector is a not-for-profit sector. And many of you in this room will come from that sector. It's an amazing sector. I spend a lot of time in it. But the reality is it's always resource constrained. And that resource constraint makes it defensive in its approach. How often do you hear people like Tim come out and speak aggressively against what's happening in Australia? It should come from the not-for-profit sector. They should be challenging government. They rarely do because of their dependence on government and donor funding. If you think about the fourth estate, television, newspapers, radio, they can hold government to account, but the reality is they are a shadow of their former selves. The internet and the way that media is being disseminated, fragmented, means that the media, traditional media, is a shadow of its former self. And finally, academia, given the social horsepower in our universities, they really should be the biggest drivers of change. The big pushers of social improvement in our economy, and they're not. And maybe it's because they've been so focused on commercialising revenues. Maybe it's because they're dependent on government funding. But how often do you hear universities get out and speak against government policy, or talk about how you can actually improve government policy and really show leadership? Now, before all those academics in the room think that I'm highly critical of universities, I'm not, because what I'm seeing at the moment are some real green shoots coming out of the universities and some real encouragement for the future. Now, let me sort of put all that together and just talk about jobs for one moment and what may happen to jobs in the future. There seems to be consensus that in the next 15 to 20 years, because of artificial intelligence and automation, we are going to lose an enormous amount of today's jobs. Now, some academics suggest that it's as high as 30 to 50% in the next 15 years. But that's where the consensus stops, and you end up with two factions. The first faction over here is saying we will never be able to create enough new jobs to replace the old jobs that we lose. And therefore, inevitably in the future, we're going to see significant levels of structural unemployment and underemployment, and therefore social disadvantage. The other faction over here gets really exasperated with that comment, with the first faction, and says that's stupid. We've heard these arguments all before. In the Industrial Revolution, people said exactly the same thing. Mark my words, human ingenuity will create enough jobs to replace jobs that are lost. So don't worry. Now here's the strange thing, and it says a lot about us as human beings. Neither side actually know, because we've never lived in a world of artificial intelligence and accelerated technology. So none of us know. It becomes an act of faith which side you're on in that argument. It's almost like religion. You sort of think you know what the answer is, but you can't prove it. Then you get the parties coming together again and saying, well, actually, irrespective of our views, one thing that is certain in the future, and that is that we are going to have to constantly retrain for new jobs as old jobs become redundant. And that is, in my mind, the smoking gun. And it's a smoking gun for two reasons. Firstly, even if we can create enough new jobs to replace jobs that are lost through artificial intelligence and automation, there is no guarantee that we'll create those new jobs in Australia. With advances in broadband technology, ever-improving advances, there is no reason why a lot of those jobs won't be created in lower-cost jurisdictions. So even if you take the view that actually human ingenuity will create as many new jobs as is lost, there's another question: how do we guarantee those jobs are created in Australia? Because without jobs in Australia, without people working, how do we actually keep people out of social disadvantage? The other part of the smoking gun is this. a lot of people in our society who aren't disadvantaged today, but actually are getting close, in my view, won't be able to keep up with the pace of change unless we create an environment which is incredibly supportive. If they don't keep up with the pace of change, they're going to fall by the wayside and become disadvantaged people. And that's going to happen in an era of constrained government budgets when the tax system is under stress because of an ageing population. So when we look into the future, when I look into the future, I'm actually very nervous about social disadvantage. I'm nervous it could get worse rather than better unless somehow we develop effective leadership in this country, which really prepares us for the future. Now, before we all get terribly depressed about what I'm saying, there are some really positive game changers which I want to throw out there in the spirit of disruption. The first game changer is the fact that we can reinvent our democracy. Now, our democracy was created in the 18th and 19th century. It's time to reinvent it. And one way we can do that is we can mobilise people's views to put pressure back onto the government to show the leadership that we all want and to communicate honestly with us. Organisations like GetUp are starting to do that. They've got a way to go, but it's an incredibly powerful force to actually get much more equality between us as people and the people who run the government. The second way that we can reinvent our democracy is a way that's been suggested by the New Democracy movement, and that is let's have citizen juries that actually make recommendations to government on sensitive issues, that actually say to the government what they think should happen. And this issue, for example, of gay equality, gay marriage, I mean, when you look at Canberra and the mess we're in at the moment, wouldn't it be better just to get a sample of people together, cross-section of the community, and ask them to recommend where we go to government so that government can actually, on the basis of that recommendation, make a decision? So there are things that are happening which can reinvent our democracy, and they're really encouraging things. The other thing is, of course, the subject matter of today, and that's social business. The great beauty of social business, and I see it overseas, is that what you're doing is you're empowering people at the local level to create change. Social business is disruptive for this reason. You're taking the business model not to maximise returns for investors, but to solve social problems. So you're taking all the power of the company model to actually do something which is incredibly positive for society. Now, I can imagine that some of you in the audience are saying, Peter, mate, this social business stuff, it sounds sort of interesting, but you're being a bit utopian. Can it really be made to work? Well, what I want to say to all of you is that actually we've got examples in Australia of major companies that started off as social businesses. AMP started off to solve the problem of people who couldn't have life cover. St George Bank started off to actually provide loans to people who couldn't access the banking system. It was only later that they converted to profit-maximising companies. The thing that stops us from actually solving social disadvantage is, frankly, a lack of imagination. If we all think disruptively about the future, if we all drive hard with the social business movement, which Mohammed Yunus will talk about later this morning, we can actually use the power of business and the power of thinking in the social sector, combine the two to solve social problems and make us all, frankly, much prouder of a country that believes that everyone is important and social disadvantage should be for history, not the present. Thank you very much.